You might be aware that EMDR is a really effective treatment for trauma, and that could be simple trauma or more complex trauma. But did you know that it also can be a really effective treatment for grief? The reason for that is that grief can, in its own way, be a very traumatic experience. And what I mean by trauma is a time where the events in someone's life exceed their capacity to process them. And what our brain does when that happens is almost takes that stuff, that unpleasant stuff, and just lumps it all together and just shoves it in a metaphorical cupboard and says, I'll deal with that later. But often what then happens is there's new stuff happening, so we never get round to processing the things that were overwhelming. So with EMDR, we have the opportunity to return in a safe way to that time, open the cupboard, reorganize what's in there, so that then, if something happens that reminds us of that event, we can go to that memory, but it's not completely overwhelming. What does that mean with grief? So often what people describe is when someone has experienced a bereavement and it's not been processed, that tends to kind of overshadow, almost kind of cloud the rest of the person's life. So when they think of the person that they've lost, all they can remember is their end of life or difficult things around that time. And sometimes people are worried that if they do EMDR processing, they will lose access to the memories. They might lose something of the memories of that person. But actually, it's the opposite that tends to be reported by people. So no memories are gone, and that sense of the end dominating the memory of that person diminishes. So they're able to remember the whole of someone's life. And in therapy, what can happen is people can get back in touch with historic memories that have different emotional tones. They might be able to get more in touch with the person that they lost through those memories. So how does grief processing work in EMDR? We look at the past, the present, and the future. So we think about the events in the past. Maybe there were events towards the end of that person's life that are forming that cloud, that block. And we just process those like we would with any other EMDR. So just going to the target and spending time close enough, but not so close that you get sucked into it. Just close enough for your brain to do that work of taking things out of that cupboard, making sense of them, putting them back in. Once that's done, we might look at triggers. So it might be that when we process the historic events, actually everything else resolves, and that's great. But it might be there could be some mopping up of triggers in the here and now. So there might be things that you see day to day that remind you of that person, or the hospital setting, or the journey to the hospital that could be processed. So we would do that if needed. And then we could look at potentially what the future would look like and make a future template, a template of doing well, managing anything that comes up. As we work through that model, often what people find is that blockage, that cloud of the end of that person's life no longer dominates to the same degree. It allows them to see the full extent of the times that they spent with that person. Essentially, that's how EMDR processing can help with resolving grief. Another thing that can be really helpful with grief is using the matrix from acceptance and commitment therapy. So ordinarily, with the matrix, we would think about your own values. But it might be that there's something about the person who has been lost and their values that someone would like to keep alive. So in that case, with the matrix, we kind of think there's an imaginary horizontal line. Below that line is stuff that's on the inside. And above that line, stuff that's on the outside. And then towards the right-hand side is moving towards what's important to that person. Moving that way is getting kind of hooked and being pulled away from what matters. And so we would start down here and say, okay, what are the values, what are the things about that person that you admired, that you would like to keep alive going into the future through your actions? Once we've established those, we'd say, okay, so when you're thinking about that, what might come up on the inside? Might it be feelings of sadness or grief, or I can't do that, I'm not that person? Anything that comes up there that might get in the way. And what might you do that perhaps in the short term takes away those feelings, those uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, but it doesn't really solve anything, doesn't resolve the issues. And then, okay, so if that's what's happening, what could you do? So what could you put into action to keep those values, those things that you loved about that person alive? Just have a think about that. So that's a kind of adaptation of the matrix that is colloquially known as the grief tricks. And that might be a really helpful way to kind of map out, okay, what do I love about that person's memory? And how can I keep that alive? So I hope this has been helpful. There's links to other resources that might be useful. And do let me know if there's any other resources that would be useful. Thanks for watching.